Our next speaker, Kevin Pawlak, he is going to wrap up here by talking about Lincoln and a changing war, the summer of 1862. Kevin Pawlak is an historic site manager for the Prince William County, Virginia Office of Historic Preservation and the author of 6 books and numerous articles about Civil War, including Ohio at Antietam, the Buckeye State Sacrifice on America's Bloodiest Day. See, another reference to Ohio State, right? And he has a forthcoming book that unfortunately does not have to do with Ohio State, but it is such a clash of arms, the Maryland Campaign of September 1862, which is coming out in May, next month? June now. Okay, June now. All right. Kevin also serves as a certified battlefield guide at Antietam National Battlefield and Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. And one thing I'll add, part of Kevin's programming at Office of Historic Preservation is a series of panel discussions on history topics that are held inside brew pubs in Prince William County. So Scott Patchen, who we just heard from, and I were invited to speak on a George Washington panel for Washington's birthday. And as we're sitting up at the table, while we're talking there, pints of beer just magically appear out of nowhere that Kevin's shoveling our way. And as soon as we're done, another one will appear. And so Scott and I turned what was supposed to be a half-an-hour presentation into about 2 hours, so that we just made sure that we were good and ready to go. So Kevin's also a tour guide at all over Prince William County and other places. So without further ado, Kevin, welcome to the National Army Museum.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everybody, for sticking around throughout the afternoon and morning with a great list of speakers to stick around and hear about the summer of 1862. I'm ashamed to say this is actually my first time in the finished National Army Museum. I got a tour in 2020 before it was open, but I'm just absolutely impressed walking around. This is by far the largest screen I think I've ever presented on. And John, I'm waiting for beers to magically pop up out of the podium for me while up here. We'll be here for a couple of hours at that point. But the summer of 1862 is, of course, a well-defined time period in terms of its seasonal, 3 months. But what I wanted to do, and thinking really about the summer of 1862, as I have for many years now, the summer of 1862, like any historic event, cannot be viewed in a vacuum solely by itself. It has to be viewed within the context of what has happened before it and what has happened after it. And in viewing that, I think that not just for Abraham Lincoln, but for the entire United States and the Confederacy, of course, for that matter as well, the summer of 1862 is really one of the most, if not the most, pivotal series of a few months in the entire American Civil War. It transforms the Civil War into a completely different conflict than what it was when the guns were first fired on Fort Sumter in 1861, and it really shows the United States and the world just what the war was really capable of becoming and ultimately would become through deadly battles, a long list of deadlier and deadlier battles that accelerated throughout the summer of 1862 itself. So where I want to start is actually back in 1861, even late 1861. At the end of that year, the first year of the war, of course, by this point, nobody, at least very few people, expected that the war was going to get out of 1861, that somehow, some way, the divided halves of the nation would come back together, or, of course, there would be 2 independent nations, as the Confederacy was trying to do. But by 1861, the end of 1861, Lincoln was really, once again, and this is a constant rotating cycle through the newspapers and politicians that are pushing President Lincoln, is really starting to feel the pressure once again of doing something, which, of course, early 1861, or at least early in the war in 1861, you have the Battle of First Manassas or First Bull Run, and relatively speaking, though not entirely, but relatively speaking, a quiet time between July 1861 and really the spring of 1862. And so Lincoln shared a few personal or private thoughts with some of his closest advisors just about what this time period was really like for him. To Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, in a well-quoted excerpt of what Lincoln had said, but I'm sure, it really just drives home what Lincoln was feeling at that time. He said, "General, what shall I do? The people are impatient. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, has no money, and he tells me he can raise no more. The general of the army, being General McClellan, whom we'll talk about shortly, has typhoid fever. The bottom is out of the tub. What shall I do?" Lincoln would travel as well to the Washington Navy Yard to have conversations with some of his close associates, including John Dahlgren. And John Dahlgren wrote in his private diary on January 2nd of 1862, after a conversation with President Lincoln, "For the first time, I heard the president speak of the bare possibility of our being two nations." Things were not looking up for Lincoln at all in early 1862, both on a public level and on a private level. Of course, both of his sons, Willie and Tad, would become sick. And early on in that year, Willie will eventually die in February of 1862 from that. So Lincoln has to not only worry about a mourning nation, but he now has to worry about his mourning wife. And Lincoln is in mourning himself, having lost one of his sons while trying to deal with what was the greatest crisis in American history up to that time, certainly. But Lincoln was really, again, starting to feel this pressure in the public sphere. And so he issued General War Order Number 1 on January 27th, which was really a sweeping war order coming from the office of the president, because it designated February 22nd, 1862 as the date when all of the Union armies would move forward to various points in attack. So this is really Lincoln, for the first time in the war, starting to grow into his role as commander-in-chief quite a bit. And you can see on the map on the screen a lot of those blue arrows moving around. Lincoln's armies will begin to move forward, not all of them on February 22nd, some before, some after, but just a quick recap of some of those campaigns. Of course, what had started out so poorly for the federal war effort and for President Lincoln in 1862 would start to turn as the winter snows melted, the roads began to dry out, leaves began to bud on the trees, and it would seem like a spring of new hope for the United States at this point. Victories at Forts Henry and Donelson by Ulysses S. Grant. Of course, a very bloody victory at Shiloh along the banks of the Tennessee River in April of 1862. Up to that point, the largest and bloodiest battle in American history. John Pope's victory along Island Number 10 in the Mississippi River, victories along New Orleans as well, and then down at the Peninsula Campaign outside of Virginia, which will be the focus of a lot of our talk, focusing on the summer of 1862 and what was going on in Virginia itself. But by Lincoln issuing this general war order, again, he's taking much more of a hands-on role in how the Union war effort was going to be played out by this point. Now, Lincoln, again, if you think about, had very little military experience. He was a militia captain in the Black Hawk War, but didn't do much at all. Lincoln himself even admitted that. But Lincoln now is really starting to grow into the role, or starting to recognize that that's the role he needed to play for the country in order to bring about the preservation of the Union and victory for the United States in this conflict and restoring the Union. So Lincoln's hand in the war grew even more exponentially in the spring of that year when the Army of the Potomac, who is commanded by George McClellan, that you see there on the right side of the screen, who Lincoln and McClellan had been butting heads throughout the winter of 1861 into the spring of 1862. McClellan had been appointed as general-in-chief of all United States armies in November of the previous year. But when he went off to begin the Peninsula Campaign, an end around the Confederate defenses at Manassas, to take a waterborne route down the Chesapeake Bay, to hit the Virginia Peninsula between the York and James Rivers and work his way up towards the Confederate capital at Richmond and try to take it. Lincoln basically believed that McClellan had too much on his hands, and so McClellan was removed as the general-in-chief of all United States armies. He retained command of the Army of the Potomac itself. But Lincoln now is left in a void, essentially, where there is no directing, guiding hand of all United States armies, at least by rank of a general itself. He is going to turn to Edwin Stanton, his newly appointed Secretary of War, after Simon Cameron is replaced, the turn of the year, 1861-62. Stanton is going to bring about a more serious attitude to the federal War Department and to the war effort itself. He was a Democrat, but nonetheless, he is going to really become Lincoln's right-hand man in prosecuting the war. But both Lincoln and Stanton were attorneys. They are not militarily trained, and it's going to take them, I would argue, even beyond the summer of 1862 to really fully grow into their roles as Commander-in-Chief and as Secretary of War that year. One other thing that's going to start to change and really put a lot of pressure on Lincoln is a military item, but it's also not. It's a social item as well. And you can see what I think is one of the greatest pictures taken during the American Civil War in the Rappahannock River. For those of you who are familiar with the town of Remington, Virginia, today it was known as Rappahannock Station at the time of the war. But this photograph that you see in the center was taken just downstream from Remington. It shows escaped slaves that are moving their way into Union lines. At that point, you can see actually a Union soldier on the left-hand side of that image. But as the Union Army begins the series of advances throughout Tennessee, Missouri, into Arkansas, Kentucky, Virginia, you name it, by nature, they're going to become into contact with more enslaved people. And that's going to really force a pressure on the Lincoln administration to figure out what to do with these people. Lincoln himself did not believe that slavery could be abolished by the Constitution. He thought that it was a state right initially, but soon enough, the pressure that Lincoln is going to get from all these slaves running into Union lines and Lincoln's generals and Lincoln's soldiers asking, what are we going to do with these people? What is our policy? What is our national policy on this? Is going to force Lincoln to really take another look and to really dedicate a lot of his time into answering this question, which is going to come into play in the summer of 1862. So by that time, again, as Union armies are advancing throughout the spring, we're going to focus here on the Confederate capital, of course, Richmond, and George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. The campaign began in March of 1862. In early April, McClellan's army began leaving the tip of the Virginia Peninsula at Fortress Monroe, working their way up the peninsula itself. They were bogged down for about a month by Confederate defenses outside of Yorktown, what becomes the Siege of Yorktown. Eventually, those Confederate defenses will not be overwhelmed. They're certainly going to be overwhelmed by an abundance of Federal artillery, but before McClellan's guns could begin to open fire, the Confederates pulled their lines back closer to the capital at Richmond itself. By June of 1862, the Federal Army was within 6 or 7 miles of Richmond. They could literally hear the bells of Richmond tolling off in the distance. It was predicted by many newspapers throughout the North and many throughout the South as well, that the experiment of the Confederacy was on its last legs. And that by July 4th of 1862, it was believed that Richmond would fall, the Confederacy would collapse, and the United States would be restored back to its former place there on the North American continent. However, things will change. Of course, things change very abruptly. And if you view the entire Civil War, but really the summer of 1862, it is just constantly a swinging pendulum. Again, momentum is in the Federals' favor going into the summer of that year. And then very quickly, almost on a dime, it's going to swing in the favor of the Confederacy instead. Robert E. Lee is going to be put in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia in early June of 1862. And about a month later, in late June, he is going to lash out at George McClellan's army that is slowly working its way around Richmond to surround Richmond and besiege the Confederate capital. And what will result is a series of battles known as the 7 Days Battles or the 7 Days Campaign that's going to drive McClellan's army away from Richmond down to the James River to Harrison's Landing itself. And all of a sudden, by July 2nd, 1862, when McClellan's army begins arriving in its encampments at Harrison's Landing, 2 days later, that's when this whole thing was supposed to be wrapped up. When everybody predicted by July 4th, 1861, Richmond would fall. Now you have newspapers like the New York World writing on the 4th of July, not talking about victories, but saying the nation is in the most eventful crisis of its history at this point. So confident were Union authorities of victory that they had shut down recruiting stations throughout the North. And also there were some financial reasons for doing that as well. But now the war has taken a very different turn and a very different picture. A State Department official, I think, had a pretty good pulse of what the Lincoln administration was feeling in Washington, had this to say about the 4th of July. He wrote that it was the gloomiest since the birth of this republic. Never was the country so low, and after such sacrifices of blood, of time, and of money. Lincoln himself later had to say this about his mindset during this time. in early July of 1862, I was as nearly inconsolable as I could be and still live. So the war has taken an incredibly dramatic turn. Now, I don't think it's any irony that during all of this, in fact, the very day that the 7 days battles begin on June 26th, Lincoln is going to appoint the man that you see on the far left-hand side of the screen, John Pope, to take command of 3 federal forces in the Northern Virginia Shenandoah Valley area, bring them together into what would become known as the Army of Virginia, and operate in central Virginia, and potentially seize an opportunity, look for an opportunity to squeeze in Richmond from 2 sides, McClellan's army coming in from the south and the east, Pope's army coming in from the north. But also, by bringing Pope east, it's not only Lincoln bringing up to this point somebody who was a successful general east to take control of military matters in Virginia, but Pope was also very much of a different political ilk than George McClellan. McClellan was a Democrat. He was a war Democrat, but certainly differed, and we'll get into this in just a little bit, on policy with President Lincoln about how the war was going to play out and how McClellan thought the war should play out versus how Lincoln thought the war should play out. Whereas John Pope was more in line with Lincoln in terms of that, but I would say Pope probably went even a little bit beyond Lincoln's thinking at this point, though perhaps there is some debate as to whether or not some of these orders, the general's orders 5, 7, and 11 that Pope would issue to his troops may have actually been promulgated by the Lincoln administration and Secretary of War Stanton. But those orders are going to take off the kid gloves, was a common refrain being used in the Union war effort at this point, and really bring the war home to the Confederacy. Up to this point, of course, the goals of the war, the objectives of the war for the Federals have been to restore the Union. In doing so, it was hoped that there would be very little effect on the Confederacy's home front, on the economy of the Confederacy itself, on the very social fabric of the Confederacy as well. But now Pope's orders are going to really bring the war to the civilians on the home front, as well as the Confederate soldiers on the battle lines as well. Those general orders, just to give a quick rundown of those, will say such things as anytime a spy is caught behind Union lines, if he does not take the oath of allegiance, he will either be executed or shipped out from Union lines into the Confederate lines. And if they're found again, they will be executed without trial. Anytime Confederate guerrillas in Northern Virginia wrecked a railroad, especially one of the United States military railroads, Pope's men would draw all the civilians within a 5-mile radius of where that destruction took place. They would be brought in to work on the railroads, to rebuild the railroads, and to do all of that at their own expense. So this is, again, really now starting to involve the Southern population into the war, as well as Southern soldiers. Not noted here either, but is somebody else who Pope will lobby to bring out with him, and that would be General-in-Chief Henry Halleck. So at this point now, by early July of 1862, when Lincoln brings Halleck east at Pope's behest, Lincoln is going to start to take his hands off of the war effort once again, believing Halleck to be capable at doing so. But within about 2 months, that bubble is going to be burst for Lincoln. And he's basically just going to say that Halleck is no better than a first-rate desk clerk, which is not a compliment at all. But what this is also going to do with the man there in the middle, Robert E. Lee, is it's going to put him into a quandary, being between now 2 Union armies trying to defend Richmond. Eventually, we'll cover this more in a bit with the Second Manassas Campaign, but what Lee is going to do is learn, after watching McClellan's army for some time, he's going to learn and think that McClellan's army is no longer a threat coming from south and east of Richmond, and so Lee's going to turn his attention towards John Pope, operating in central and northern Virginia. But we will get there, because before Lee got there, Lincoln himself came down to Harrison's Landing in early July to visit with George McClellan. This is a sketch of the encampment there at Harrison's Landing itself, just about 20 miles outside of Richmond. And a very important point in the McClellan-Lincoln relationship takes place during Lincoln's visit to McClellan's army at Harrison's Landing itself. Lincoln and McClellan had, of course, corresponded quite frequently from the time McClellan was brought east in July of 1861, all the way until a year later in July of 1862. The relationship was initially pretty cordial. It takes 2 people to wreck a relationship, and slowly that began to erode from both sides with Lincoln and McClellan. But right before the 7 days campaigns began, McClellan had requested of President Lincoln permission to offer his views on how the war should be carried out. And at this point, there was certainly a lot of talk about, Second Confiscation Act was on the way, which was going to be a measure that was really going to change Union policy toward dealing with escaped slaves. And McClellan at this point felt the need, as a war Democrat and as somebody who had a different viewpoint on how the war should play out than Lincoln, to offer his views. So he asked Lincoln permission. Lincoln said yes, I will allow you to do so. And then the 7 days happened. And so McClellan didn't have time to write all that much during that time. But when Lincoln came down to Harrison's Landing July 6th and 7th of 1862, McClellan handed Lincoln a letter in person. Lincoln didn't read it at the time. He simply put it in his pocket and said he'd get to it when he would. And later on, though, this letter that became known as the Harrison's Landing letter from McClellan really, I think, does a great job of highlighting just what the Democratic viewpoint of the war was at this point. McClellan was just voicing what many people had thought throughout the United States, but basically saying the war should not become a revolution, that this war should not subjugate Southern civilians. The war should be fought between opposing armies on a battlefield. It should not affect the Southern fabric of life as it seemed like it was going towards. And so McClellan is trying to almost put those kid gloves back on, again, to use that common expression from the summer of 62, to deal with the Confederacy civilians in a much more soft manner. That, however, is going to go out the window almost completely. I'm sure Lincoln read the letter, but probably was not terribly impressed by it, because within 15 days, he would announce, at least to his cabinet, a very sweeping war measure. Lincoln's first mention of this is just such a great painting painted by Francis Carpenter, and it's titled "The First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation." This is a view. Carpenter spent 6 months in the White House with Lincoln in 1864, interviewing him about this moment in American history. So it's just a great illustration of what Lincoln's office was like and what one of these cabinet meetings was like. But Lincoln had been slowly getting pushed, and I think pushing himself, towards moving towards a harder stance towards the institution of slavery and what the federal war policy was going to be about that in 1862. Lincoln had been trying, again, believing that it was a state's right to abolish slavery within states' boundaries, that it could not be constitutionally done. Lincoln had at least gotten the support of Congress to push for gradual compensated emancipation for especially border states where, of course, they had not seceded from the Union, but slavery was still legal there. And Lincoln on July 12th met with a group of border state representatives at the White House, 28 of them, and pushed his plan once again to try and get states like Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland to allow for this gradual compensated emancipation. Lincoln's viewpoint on that was basically that if he could show the states that had declared themselves in rebellion in the Confederacy that slavery was that weak and would crumble that easily in these border states, that they might give up the whole game. However, of course, that did not work out, because he didn't even get the chance to offer gradual compensated emancipation, because those border state representatives turned down his proposal there on July 12th. The next day, July 13th, Lincoln was riding in a carriage with Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles and Secretary of State William Seward to a funeral of one of Edwin Stanton's infant children. And there on July 13th was the first time that Lincoln actually broached the topic of emancipation itself, saying to both Welles and Seward, "Things had gone on from bad to worse until I felt that we had reached the end of our rope on the plan of operations we had been pursuing, that we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game." So 9 days later, Lincoln called together his cabinet. You can see them all arrayed there. And he told them on July 22nd in his office that he had not called them together to ask for their advice, that his mind was made up about issuing a proclamation of emancipation that would set free all of the slaves in the states in rebellion. Lincoln did say, however, he was willing to take some advice from his cabinet members. And ultimately, the only serious bit of advice that would really influence the summer of 1862 is the advice he got from Secretary of State William Seward, who said to issue the proclamation now, or to announce it now, would look like, when everything is going so badly for the Northern war effort, would look like the last shriek on our retreat. That was Seward's words to Lincoln. And it was, Lincoln, of course, was very fond of Seward and did not take his advice lightly. And so Lincoln agreed that to issue the proclamation in July of 1862 would not look good for his administration. So Lincoln agreed to fold that document, put it up in a cubbyhole in his desk. He would take it out every once in a while and work on it, but to wait finally for a federal battlefield victory, preferably in the eastern theater of the war, to then finally announce the Emancipation Proclamation itself. Lincoln would have to wait much longer than he probably hoped and thought he would have to wait, because events on the battlefield continued to spiral downward for the federal war effort. In August of 1862, Lee's army was going to move away from Richmond, move north again to confront Pope's army in central, and if it could, push Pope out of central Virginia into northern Virginia as well. At this point, too, Henry Halleck, who again is brand new to taking over command as general-in-chief of all United States armies, has decided to pull McClellan's army off of the Virginia Peninsula, away from Richmond, and combine the two armies somewhere in northern Virginia. So Pope is trying to fight for time to get these two armies together, which at that point, if the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Virginia could have been combined, would have presented an overwhelmingly large and superior force numerically to Lee's army, and an overland route to Richmond might have been blown open by this larger federal army, these combined armies moving south towards Richmond. Of course, Lee did not want that to happen. Lee moved quickly to make sure that that did not happen. And beginning in mid-August, Lee began to try and force Pope out of central Virginia, at least force Pope back towards Washington. And if he couldn't do that, then bring Pope to battle and the portions of the Army of the Potomac that had joined Pope by this point, and try to deal a crushing blow to the federal army. Pope's army continued. They parried Lee well enough, but eventually were constantly being forced out of position and forced to pull back closer and closer to Washington, D.C. So again, things were not looking up for the war effort in August of that year. However, Lincoln himself had fire on all sides of him. He had to deal with what's going on in the Eastern Theater, the Western Theater, what's going on the home front as well. And he's really starting to get a lot of pressure in the papers about what to do about this question of slavery and emancipation. And Horace Greeley, New York newspaper editor, would very famously write a letter, The Prayer of 20 Millions, basically begging the president to issue some proclamation of emancipation. Lincoln famously wrote back to him on August 22nd of 1862, so a month after he's already told his cabinet he's going forward with this Emancipation Proclamation. This is what Lincoln had to say, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this line, but I think it's worth repeating. Lincoln responded to Greeley's letter, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." There was Lincoln's official word on that, which is oft quoted. However, I think something that's interesting to note, a lot of folks will use this to indicate that Lincoln was not interested in abolishing slavery throughout the United States. Lincoln would end his letter by saying, "I have here stated my purpose according to my official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." So Lincoln at this point, I think, is trying to soften the blow of emancipation on the Northern public and what they might think of his Emancipation Proclamation. Now, at this point, though, things are going to continue spiraling downward for Lincoln. Pope's army, portions of the Army of the Potomac, will be defeated at the Battle of Second Manassas in 3 days in late August of 1862. The federal army will be driven back into the defenses of Washington. The very same day, August 30th of that year, when Pope's army is defeated at Second Manassas. I would argue this is probably the darkest day for the federal war effort in all 4 years of the Civil War, August 30th. You not only have Pope being defeated, but you have a Confederate force under Kirby Smith advancing north into Kentucky and defeating a federal force at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, one of the most lopsided victories of the entire Civil War that also takes place on August 30th of 1862. But now by the summer of 1862, you have Confederate counteroffensives across a 1,000-mile front. Not only is Leban moving north through Virginia, and eventually, of course, will cross the Potomac River into Maryland, William Loring is leading a Confederate force towards Charleston, Virginia at the time, now West Virginia. Kirby Smith and Braxton Bragg are moving north through Tennessee and into Kentucky. There's also a Confederate force under Earl Van Dorn and Sterling Price that are moving towards Corinth, Mississippi. And there's a Confederate force that is launching attacks against Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The Confederacy has the initiative at this point in the war. And again, things are looking about as bleak as they ever possibly could have for the Federals. Lincoln himself had this to say, that he seemed wrung by the bitterest anguish, that he almost felt ready to hang himself in the summer of 1862. Imagine a president thinking that. But Lincoln knew that he could not give up the war just yet. And in September of 1862, early that month, as rumors reached Lincoln about what Lee's army might be doing, moving across the Potomac River into Maryland, Lincoln turned once again to George McClellan to take command of the armies behind the defenses of Washington, lead those armies out from behind those defenses, and attack and drive Lee's army out of Maryland, ultimately. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is Lincoln basically makes the decision with Halleck's blessing, but at this point, again, Lincoln has started to really see Henry Halleck as somebody who's not going to have much sway in Lincoln's mind on how the war is going to be played out. But what's really interesting when thinking about the summer of 1862 and just how dark of a time period this was, not only for Lincoln personally, but the United States as a whole, Edwin Stanton by this point was completely, and that's an understatement, fed up with George McClellan, to the point where when it was being debated and contested about who would take these Union forces that had been beaten at Second Manassas, beaten at the 7 Days, and cobble them together in the behind the defenses of Washington, Edwin Stanton was going behind Lincoln's back to get a petition signed by other of Lincoln's cabinet members, basically saying, you're not going to appoint McClellan to command this army, and if you do, we're going to resign, and basically dissolve Lincoln's administration. September 2nd, Stanton and 4 other members had signed this petition. One of the members that signed it, Salmon Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, claimed that basically either the government or McClellan must go down. Talk about personal animus towards one man. The cabinet was getting ready to meet on September 2nd. Stanton had this paper in his pocket. He was ready to present it to President Lincoln. And before Lincoln arrived, Stanton got there first, burst into the room, and exclaimed that he had learned that McClellan had been appointed to take command of the Union armies behind the defenses of Washington. Stanton, nonetheless, still presented this document to Lincoln, and that's when Lincoln said he felt ready to hang himself because he had made a decision that did not go very well, at least in the minds of his cabinet members. But nonetheless, Lincoln was a man of convictions. He was a man that stood by his decision and would tell McClellan before leaving Washington to get Lee's army out of Maryland and back into Virginia. Lincoln not only told McClellan that was his bar for victory, but according to Lincoln's own words, he made a promise to God himself that was going to be his bar for victory, and that if McClellan could do that, that Lincoln would follow up that victory with the announcement of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So over the course of 16 days in September of 1862, McClellan's army, which was badly in shape in terms of not just its physical form, but also the morale as well. These are some quotes you can see that I pulled from letters and diaries of Union soldiers talking just about what the morale was of the Union army, or the lack of morale, I should say. People saying basically I have other accounts as well of Union soldiers basically saying, we're just ready to go home and get this, just be done with it. The Confederacy wants to be free, let them go. We're tired of doing this. But one thing that I think Robert E. Lee underestimated was the morale boost that his movement into Maryland would be for the Union Army. that now Lee was north of the Potomac River on northern soil as they viewed it. And so the Union Army, under McClellan's command, had a little bit more pep in its step. It moved out from behind the defenses of Washington, engaged Lee's army at 3 battles in Maryland and Western Virginia in September of that year, claiming 2 victories, of course, the Battle of South Mountain on September 14th, Sunday, September 14th, and then 3 days later, the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American military history, where over the course of 12 hours of fighting, 23,110 soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac would be killed, wounded, missing, or captured. That's 1 person every 2 seconds for 12 straight hours. And those farms and fields and woodlots outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, and along Antietam Creek. Once it had been confirmed by Lincoln and by McClellan that the Army of the Potomac had permanently driven Lee out of Maryland back across the Potomac River into Virginia, on September 22nd, Lincoln called his cabinet together once more, and he showed them the draft of his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that soon went out to the presses. Basically, it was a 100-day ultimatum to the Confederate States to give up the fight, or Lincoln would sign this proclamation into effect, and that would be the document that would free approximately 3.5 million slaves in the southern states, in the Confederate States. Lincoln had 100 days to get the Northern war effort back on track and back together, because he was certainly well aware that this proclamation would mean little without victories on a battlefield. And so he had to contend with many of his commanding generals, our commanding armies in the field, about what to do next, what was the next plan, how to support this paper document with military might. Lincoln traveled to the Antietam battlefield for 4 days in early October. He met with McClellan, where it's a very famous photograph. You can see Lincoln standing next to McClellan, the two of them staring each other down out in front of the Grove House. This is actually privately owned land, but the house that you see in the background still stands. You can go and visit it. There's a Civil War Trails marker just outside of it on the west side of Sharpsburg. But it's just an absolutely incredible meeting between these two men, because over these 4 days, when they are talking about war strategy and what Lincoln wants McClellan to do, which is to advance, and McClellan wants to spend more time reorganizing and refitting his army, both of them come out of that meeting with the exact opposite idea of what was said. Lincoln believed he had McClellan's assurances that he was going to move forward. McClellan believed he had Lincoln's assurances that he could spend some time refitting and reorganizing the army. So what exactly happened and what was exactly said between those two men? Hard to tell, because both Lincoln and McClellan said different things about it. But nonetheless, by this point, McClellan was starting to become expendable for Lincoln. And especially one big black eye on McClellan in the aftermath of Antietam was not so much the fact of refitting his army, but it was McClellan's response to the Emancipation Proclamation. On October 7th, McClellan finally issued orders to soldiers of the Army of the Potomac about how to react to the proclamation itself. And he had this to say, which isn't exactly a ringing endorsement. He said, "Armed forces are raised and supported simply to sustain the civil authorities and are to be held in strict subordination thereto in all respects. This fundamental rule of our political system is essential to the security of our Republican institutions and should be thoroughly understood and observed by every soldier. The principle upon which and the object for which armies shall be employed in suppressing rebellion must be determined and declared by the civil authorities." So McClellan is saying we have to bow to the civil authorities. However, he goes on to say, "The remedy for political errors, if any are committed, is to be found only in the action of the people at the polls." Coming up in mid-October, early November, the midterm elections in 1862. McClellan's essentially saying, if you don't like the Emancipation Proclamation, go vote and vote Republicans out, bring Democrats in. That's going to be a black eye in that relationship, something that can't be repaired between those two men. And by early November, right after, literally the day after the elections close, the polls close, Lincoln is going to send out orders replacing McClellan and putting Ambrose Burnside in command of the Army of the Potomac. But by the winter of 1862, typically a time unlike the summer and fall and spring months when military campaigning is commonplace, Lincoln urged his armies forward once more. Despite the snow, despite the cold, despite the roads becoming quagmires, Lincoln ordered his armies forward. He ordered them forward in central Tennessee, William Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland, Grant's forces on the Mississippi River Delta were ordered to move forward and try to seize Vicksburg. And of course, Ambrose Burnside would be pushed to try and deal the Army of Northern Virginia a crippling blow at Fredericksburg. Two of those three came to resounding Union defeats, Grant's efforts to take Vicksburg, and Burnside, of course, at Fredericksburg. But nonetheless, on January 1st, 1863, after shaking hands in a public reception for over 3 hours, Lincoln was called to his office in the White House to put his name officially to the Emancipation Proclamation that would be put into effect that day. As he pulled his pen, dipped it into his inkwell, his hand was shaking, so much to the point that some people looked at him and thought he was nervous about signing the proclamation and putting it into effect. Lincoln looked at them, smiled slightly, and said never in his life did he believe he was doing something more right than putting the Emancipation Proclamation into effect. So the summer of 1862 had taught Lincoln that emancipation was a military necessity that was essential to preserving the Union. But the only way the Union could be ultimately preserved was through military might. And so, as 1862 closed, he sent his armies into battle to make emancipation a solidified war objective. The spilling of blood, something that again grew commonplace in the summer of 1862 as casualty lists grew between the two armies, rather than the spilling of ink, was what was required, and Lincoln knew it, to pass the nation through its fiery trial, the depths of which were never darker for Lincoln than in the summer of 1862. Thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Great presentation. Two questions. One is, we really focus on President Lincoln, but by 1862, we have two, and you mentioned these, two confiscation acts, 1861 and 1862. How did that influence? I mean, to some extent, I get the impression that Congress is pushing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, there was strong consideration on the part of the Europeans, particularly the British, of intervention. How close did Britain come, and what impact did the Emancipation Proclamation have on British intervention in the war?
Sure. The first question about the Confiscations Act, the first one was in August of 1861 that Congress issued that. And basically the basic premise of the first Confiscation Act was that any enslaved people found directly aiding the Confederate war effort, so building earthworks, driving as teamsters or cooks in the Confederate Army, that fell into Union lines would be freed. Later on, the second Confiscation Act went a step further and saying that any slaves found of a disloyal person in the South would be freed. So whether they aided the war effort or not, they would become freed. There's a great debate going on that's been going on for a long time, and I think it's a very healthy debate about who ultimately pushed emancipation. Was it the soldiers on the front lines who are dealing with these enslaved people coming into their lines and them throwing up their hands and saying, we don't know what to do? What's our policy on this? Generals? Was it slaves themselves that were coming into Union lines and, of course, forcing this question upon the Northern war effort? Was it Lincoln? Was it Congress? I think the question is, it's all of them combined. But you look at that, I mean, again, that picture that I showed early on, taken outside of Remington, Virginia, shows from the ground up the process of emancipation. But then the Confiscation Act showed the congressional policies, the congressional take on all of that. And then, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation shows Lincoln. So I think it's all of them. In terms of the proclamation's impact on Britain and France and what they might have done during the war, September 17th, 1862, important day in American history, right? The Battle of Antietam. That very day, as of course, news traffic is delayed getting to England. Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is meeting with his cabinet, and they're starting to read reports of what has happened at Second Manassas. And Palmerston says, we're going to follow this campaign northwest of Washington, very good detail. And basically what Palmerston says is we must strike while the iron is hot. Meaning if we're going to jump in and diplomatically recognize and support the Confederacy, we need to do it while the Confederacy is on the up and up rather than the other way around. Of course, that won't end up happening. And part of the reason ultimately for that is Lincoln's proclamation. I don't think Lincoln issued the proclamation with the mindset of it's going to keep Britain and France away from the war. Because initially that did not seem like that's what was going to happen. There was a lot of outcry in Britain about this, sort of not so much of the character of what Lincoln was trying to do, but how it was done. Eventually, however, that started to change and take hold amongst the common folk, the common workers of England, in Great Britain, and public opinion started to sway in Lincoln's favor. And one thing about Great Britain is they had abolished slavery in their empire in the 1830s. Great Britain held itself up as a high standard throughout the world of having abolished slavery. And so for them now to jump in and recognize the Confederacy, which basically by Lincoln's proclamation has now been forced to come out and say it's fighting to preserve the institution of slavery, and for Lincoln to now publicly make the Union war effort about that, for Great Britain to step in and say, we're going to be on the side that where slavery is legal and is not trying to abolish slavery, would have been a terrible PR nightmare for them throughout. So eventually the proclamation does help keep Great Britain and France at arm's length. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, question from Zoom. Had there not been a Battle of Antietam at all, would the Union victory at Perryville, Kentucky a month later be important enough to warrant the announcement of the proclamation?
That's a great question. Had there not been Battle of Antietam, I don't think Perryville would have been enough, for the simple reason that this is not a knock against the Western theater at all in the Civil War, and I mean that truthfully. But you think about where all the newspaper hubs are and where the media is. There's a reason the Eastern theater is still more studied than the Western theater today. Now, again, I'm not saying that the Western theater is not important, because I think the Western theater is critically important to why the Confederacy ultimately fails. But I just don't think the press would have been the same for Buell's victories out in Kentucky as compared to what was going on out in the Eastern theater. And Lincoln even, take him for whatever his word is, he specifically says, on September 22nd, when he's telling his cabinet, this is what we're doing, that I'm issuing this proclamation, he specifically says when Lee's army was at Frederick in Maryland, that's when he made that promise, and that as soon as Lee's army would be driven out of Maryland, that's what he was going to take as his measuring stick again for issuing the proclamation. So I think that's really where Lincoln was looking. I think Lincoln would have waited as long as he felt he needed to get what he believed was enough of a victory to follow that up with the proclamation.
So the follow-up question is, why do you hate the Western theater?
Where's the exit? I do think, and really the Western theater is, again, it's not as studied as well. The battles in some cases aren't as large, but I think what's really interesting, I've kind of always said this, the Eastern theater is where the Civil War is ultimately won by the Federals, because by 1865, Lee's army is the Confederacy, and Lee's army is in the Eastern theater. But the Western theater is what keeps the Union war effort going, because while the armies in the Eastern theater are trying to figure things out for 1862, 1863, into early 1864, it's the armies in the West that are providing the only good news to Lincoln. And Lincoln will admit as much in, I believe it's August of 1863, when he's trying to get William Rosecrans to move forward once again towards Chattanooga. Lincoln will write Rosecrans a letter basically saying that if we hadn't had your victory at Murfreesboro or Stones River from December 31st of 62 to January 2nd, he said, we don't know where this country would have been lost. That, when Lincoln sends troops forward towards Vicksburg, towards Fredericksburg, towards Murfreesboro, Murfreesboro is the only one that could be hailed as a Union victory. And so the West is what really props up and continues the war to the point where the Confederacy gets worn down. So that might be my unpopular answer, but I don't think one or the other theater is completely exclusive when determining what decided the fate of the Civil War, the outcome. So.
You had mentioned that Lincoln had relieved McClellan the day after the election. I just was interested to know, was that a political calculation? And following up on that, is there information on how the soldiers themselves voted in the 1862 and 64 elections as compared to the general population?
So the soldier question for the 1864 election, I don't have the stats exactly, but about 80% of the federal soldiers, I can't remember the number that vote, but 80% of them vote for Lincoln over McClellan, even though McClellan was still loved in the Army of the Potomac. But McClellan had done some things in October of 1863, that's a whole other story, that he wasn't as highly regarded anymore in the Army of the Potomac, let's say that, after that. In terms of whether or not Lincoln removed McClellan the day after, I don't think that's a coincidence. I do think Lincoln was Lincoln had so many excuses that he could have pulled the plug on McClellan anytime he wanted. But with the war effort being in a relatively fragile state at this point in the war, I don't think Lincoln could afford to lose Democratic voters. For, again, not just to put Republicans in office, but to put war Democrats in office as well, and to remove the golden child of the war Democrats right before the elections is not going to be a good look at all. And so I do think, I would say it was politically motivated in terms of the date being held off until the day after the elections, but Lincoln was ready to oust McClellan earlier than that, certainly. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have one more from Zoom. What was the basis of the personal issue between Porter and Pope?
Oh, gosh. Got another 45 minutes, John? All right, I'll be real quick. Pope and Porter's differences started earlier on than just the two of them serving together in the Second Manassas campaign. It really started, at least for Pope. Porter was promoted above Pope, and Pope wrote a letter to Lincoln saying, "What the heck? I have more experience in the Army than Porter does. Why are you promoting this guy?" And it wasn't just Porter, it was others as well. But Porter is going to be the scapegoat for Pope's defeat at Second Manassas. The reasoning for that is Pope had been shown some dispatches that Porter had not so smartly written to Ambrose Burnside, saying all sorts of nasty things about Pope, that Pope was an ass, that strategy was at 6s and 7s, which is a term from back then indicating that basically nobody knows what they're doing, so clearly a knock on Pope. Pope was shown those letters, Lincoln had seen those letters, and so Pope turned all of his wrath, really wanted to turn his wrath on McClellan, I would say, but couldn't get McClellan, and so settled for Porter, who was one of McClellan's close associates instead. And the two of them battled about that for the rest of their lives. Porter was cashiered from the Army. He's the highest officer to be cashiered from the Army during the war, and spends the next 24 years of his life trying to get his rank and his name and his reputation restored. So that's a whole other talk that could be a whole symposium unto itself. But that's it in a nutshell. So thank you all very much.